Hello, everybody. It's great to be back with you again after a ruckus and wild Town Hall number 3, in case you were there last Thursday. As you can see, I've survived that experience with Bill Thomas, which was a lot of fun. And here we are in episode 36 of Compass Games Live. Today's Thursday, July 16th. I want to thank you for joining us. If you're joining us from Facebook or YouTube, it's great to have you here again. As you know, right above me here, we're going to be speaking today. Our special guest is Ernie Copley, the designer of the War Europe, as well as the upcoming War of the Pacific, 1941 through 1945. So we're going to be welcoming Ernie here in just a few minutes. First, I just want to get just a few things out of the way, as I normally do. So again, we'll be talking with Ernie Copley shortly, but in the meantime, as you can see here, Brotherhood and Unity, I have just over my other shoulder. That is our next game release. So Brotherhood and Unity is scheduled for release on the 24th of July. So we're getting prepped for shipping that game. It's just going to be just a little over a week from now. We're going to be shipping Brotherhood and Unity. I know a lot of people are excited about that. Also, Traders of the Air was, of course, our most recent game release. That's the last game we released. And you can see South China Sea above me. That was one of the pre-order announcements we made as far as one of the several reprints that we decided to put on pre-order that people were excited about. So a lot going on, and actually let's talk a little bit more about that. So again, just as a helpful reminder, from our homepage, which you're seeing now, that yellow box that you can't miss on the left column, that's to join our newsletter. We send out an issue about once a week. It will have all the latest news, links to our latest broadcasts, including our upcoming broadcasts, any special offers, etc. You know, it's really a great way to get information from us. And again, we only will email you once a week, typically, sometimes maybe twice a week if there's a special announcement. Also, I do want to mention that we have our upcoming release schedule. So it's a little hard to see here on screen, but just to mention again, we have Brotherhood and Unity that's going to be shipping on July 24th. And then we have 2 titles in August. It's going to be Red Poppies Campaigns Volume 3 and Commands and Colors Tricorn Jacobite Rising, which was also featured on Kickstarter recently. Those are our 2 August releases. And then in September, we have another 2 releases. We have Dawn's Early Light, which was also featured as well on Kickstarter. And then a lot of people have been looking forward to the much anticipated designer signature edition of Victory Games, The Korean War by Joseph Bukowski. So that's our lineup through September. But again, in about 8 days, we're going to be shipping Brotherhood and Unity. As a reminder, we have a Kickstarter active right now. So if you go to Kickstarter, you can type in either Compass Games, or if you know the name of the game, here it is, An Attrition of Souls. We have another 2 weeks or so on Kickstarter. So if you haven't pre-ordered the game already, you can go ahead and place a pledge for it on our current Kickstarter campaign. So again, something we're really excited about, having that game ready to come out. It's going to be a beautiful strategic game, mounted map. Actually, Bill Thomas showed some of the components last week. Everybody got a chance to see the components to Attrition of Souls last week during Town Hall number 3. And then I do want to mention again, we are still planning for Compass Games Expo 2020 in November. So, you know, we're watching the numbers with COVID, etc. And Bill's being very careful with that. And it seems like in Connecticut, things are looking fairly good. So we're still looking for people to register. Right now, I believe we just had another registration come through recently. So we've got 18 already that are registered for the event. And then you can see what games they're signing up for. You can get to this page just by selecting Expo 2020. Again, Expo 2020 on the home page. So we hope we'll be able to hold this event in November. Of course, if for any reason, if we do have to cancel, you can rest assured that your money can be refunded, or you can have it roll over as a credit for when we're able to do Compass Expo again. So, but we are planning for Expo 2020 in November over Veterans Day weekend. That is still the plan. So I just want to make you all aware of that. So please go ahead and take time to register if you would like to attend, and that would be wonderful. So without further ado, what I'd like to do now is I'm going to just stop sharing for a moment so we can introduce our special guest for this evening, and I look forward to your questions. I don't know if many of you have met Ernie Copley, but I've had the privilege of knowing Ernie for quite a few years from Console World Expo, as well as the Compass Expo event, where he's been playing his games or doing play tests of his games. So really happy to have Ernie joining us today. So how you doing tonight, Ernie?
Good. How you doing?
And you're joining us. I think you're in Maine right now, right? So you're
We
East Coast,
are.
East
Yeah,
Coast,
we're
Maine.
just north of Portland, Maine.
Great. So I'm going to give everybody a chance to get some questions ready for you. Of course, we're going to be talking about the War Europe series for sure. But first, I'd like to just go through some basic questions, just more background, so people can get to know you a little bit better. And we're gonna focus on your background around gaming, around our hobby to start. So some really basic questions that I always ask every designer. And the first one being is, how did you get, if you can recall, how did you get introduced to the hobby, wargaming, and what age were you, etc.? How did that happen?
Oh, I got a game of Avalon Hill's Gettysburg back in 1965 when I was 12 years old. So a neighbor had it and wanted to get rid of it because he couldn't figure it out. So we sold it to a kid, that would be me, and I've been playing war games since I was 12, since 1965.
That's great.
That
Did you have
was
a favorite Avalon Hill game when you were young? Because you started with
oh
anyone you,
yeah,
yeah, which one?
Africa Corps,
Africa Corps. Okay, well,
classic. Yeah,
yeah, I
it's a
know there were a lot of
classic.
general articles on like Perfect Strategy. They did all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff around Africa Corps. So
Oh yeah.
that's great. So it's good to know your interest in Avalon Hill starting at the beginning.
Way
Um,
back.
so so you've been gaming for quite a while. So really sort of a transition question for you. So a lot of people I talk to, the majority of our hobby, we're gamers like myself. We don't go into design. Maybe we don't do development. We don't do anything like that.
Right.
So I'm curious how you went from gaming to how you started inching over to design. So did you go straight to design, or did you do house rules, or did you have a project you started with? What led you towards becoming a game designer? Could you share with us a little bit about that
Yeah,
journey?
you kind of edge into it. I'd been a big fan of the original Avalon Hill Third Reich game, Rise and Decline of the Third Reich, and I played that for a lot of years. And then later they came out with Advanced Third Reich, and I got into that. And I was just a player back then, but I was on the playtest group with Bruce Harper, who was redoing the Third Reich franchise into what's now called the World at War monster game from GMT. So I was involved in playtesting of that extensively, and so I got sort of front row seat on how Bruce designs his work. And then I tried my hand at a lengthy series of optional rules and so on for Avalanche's John Proutis' Third Reich, which is sort of a
Right.
bucket of dice cousin of the original Third Reich. So first I was a fan, and then I was a playtester, and then I was a creator of house rules. And then I thought, I think I can design a game that is where the original Third Reich should have evolved into if it had gone the way I wanted it to go.
So
So
that was
that's how I got
sort
into it.
that was your inspiration, just your time spent with John Pratos's Third Reich from Avalanche Press. That really got you into
Yeah.
house rules and thinking about systems, and that led you to the War of the Europe. Then Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. I started working on the War Europe 39-45 in 2004. So that took a long time to gestate because I was new. It was a monster game, and I didn't realize how much work there was involved. But eventually, we did get published in 2012, and subsequently, we did an expansion kit. And between some rules updates and the expansion, the War Europe has been pretty thoroughly debugged, I think. So naturally, after I did the expansion, people started asking, "Well, where's the Pacific game?" So I started. So I started the
Of
Pacific
course.
game. Of course, started the Pacific game 6 years ago.
Great. Well, let me just show here again, because this was a recent announcement. So I'm happy to say here we're looking at the pre-order page. We've gone to pre-order on the reprint for the War, which makes, I think, perfect sense because, we're out of stock. It's sold out, I think, last year. And now that we have the War of the Pacific coming, which we're going to be talking about at length tonight, people have asked Compass, are you going to make the War Europe available? Because I don't have that game yet. And I definitely want Pacific. I know that's coming, but I really would then like to have Europe to go with it because it all comes together. So I'm very pleased to say, yes, here it is. It's on pre-order for everybody for the reprint. And just to clarify, a reprint means it is a straight reprint, so it's the same components through and through. Everything goes through the printer again, but we do add like a corrections clarification sheet inside the box. But I think I saw somebody commented today on the Constant World forum, like, yeah, it doesn't even need a second edition rules. I mean, the game is great the way it is, so it's just wonderful to know the game will be available again for sure. And then, of course, you mentioned already the expansion. So there is a separate expansion for the game, which is wonderful. Can you talk just for a moment, just briefly, what did the expansion do for the War Europe? What's this expansion kit have in it, and what does it do for the game, like scenarios, etc.?
Well, a couple of things. The first one was that the original design of the War Europe was supposed to have 24 scenarios in it. And that was financially not feasible, according to Ken Dingley. He said, whoa, you got to cap this. So a lot of material got kind of left on the cutting room floor originally. So all sorts of what I think interesting scenarios that got put into the expansion kit. The second thing that was very helpful in working on that one was that I kind of put in every possible bell, whistle, and gadget in the expansion kit that might answer any glitches or concerns with TW Europe. Meaning, if suppose in your game Spain is falling too easily to the Axis, well, there's an optional rule in the expansion kit that makes Spain much, much harder to conquer or to bring into your bring onto your side diplomatically. So I won't call it a fixer, but it sort of filled in a lot of gaps based upon gamer feedback. That was, and I'm very glad that I did that. The expansion was definitely worth the time.
And as mentioned here from Martin, who joins us over on YouTube, yeah, he says your support for the game, for the games, plural, is amazing. And yeah, check out the topic on Constant World forum. You've got all kinds of attachments and things, and you've got a website. You've got an incredible amount of resources available. So if anybody, matter of fact, what I'd like to do is just a show of hands. So everybody who's on YouTube and Facebook right now, and I know there's going to be a lag, so I'll come back to it. So if you own either the War Europe or the expansion, if you could, or if you've played it, maybe you don't own it, but you've played it or you've seen it played, just give us a +1 in the comment stream, just to get an idea of. I'd like to see who's either touched the game, either personally, privately by owning it, or who's seen it being played at a convention like our Constant World or Compass Expo. So just throw in a +1 on the comment stream. That will be wonderful. And then thanks also to Dan on Facebook. He's definitely going to pre-order the game. Can't wait for the release as well. So thanks for that. Also want to let everybody know, I just took a jaunt over. I always like to see what people say about the game. So I went over here to Board Game Geek and found, right away some ratings of 10 out of 10 and really nice comments. One from a gentleman in overseas in France and another person in Florida. Actually, that's Rick in Florida. I know who Rick is. So he's a great guy, and really a nice testimonial from France about having played all the scenarios plus the campaign in the War Europe. The game is fantastic, compares it to the other games, and then he talks about why he thinks it's superior for him, why he found it to be a superior game experience versus the other well-known games. So really nice to see these comments and ratings and reviews. You're really getting some great feedback about the game. So obviously there's a really good following, and then I'm following right now. So just to give you an idea, so people are chiming in now. So Martin's a +1, JRV's a +1 on YouTube, Don's gonna get Pacific, so that's a +1 because he's pre-ordered it. Mark Ruggiero, Mark has to get 2 of everything, so he's like a +2 squared to the nth degree. Thanks, right, Mark, for your support. Will there be okay, so here's a question. Will the East Front section for D-Day 44? So trying to process that question. Will East Front section for D-Day 44? I'm not sure I'm understanding that question. Is there a D-Day 44 scenario in the War Europe? I'm assume.
Yeah.
Invasion.
I'm not sure what the context is. There are Eastern Front scenarios in the war
Yep.
and also in the expansion kit. And there's a D-Day scenario in the war for the Western Front. I'm not sure what the rest
So
of the context is.
the war Europe's covering all of Europe. It's Western Eastern Front. So there is,
Yeah.
the D-Day, there is the 44 D-Day stuff going on. There's a lot of scenarios actually, and in the expansion kit. Your
Yeah.
expansion added a lot more scenarios to the war Europe as well.
Yeah,
So
including some alternative history scenarios.
yeah, exactly. So then Dan says he wishes to get it. So let's hope so. And Jason's a +1 over
Good.
on Facebook. Appreciate that. Maha's a +1 on YouTube. Darren's a +1. So you got a lot of +1s here. You're in good company. So
Good.
that usually means if you're in good company and people know the game's pretty good, they might come back at you with some pretty aggressive, tough asking questions about the system. So I like that we have a tough crowd. They like to ask tough questions. So we'll see where that goes. Okay, and then Jason saying, I think the question was about an East Front companion to France 44. Okay,
different. Okay,
that's a
context.
different game. So yeah, waiting for Mark Herman to get the design in on Russia 44. So yeah, we're waiting on that one. That makes sense now to me for sure. So yeah, I get it. Yeah, it's not related to the war, but it is another game from Compass. So all sounds good. Okay, here's an interesting question. See, Mark, here we go. Here's the hard hitting stuff. I told you it's going to come. I warned you, Ernie. So how about the missing Italian fleet? Did it ever make an appearance? So there must be some insider track on that. I don't know where that question is coming from, but Mark wants to ask you that question.
Well, I can respond by saying that's the first I've heard of a missing Italian fleet. It's not the first I've heard of a missing British fleet. There was a missing British 112.5 fleet in the original copy of the war. It is included in the a copy of that is in the expansion kit. So there was a missing British fleet. I'm not aware of any missing Italian fleets.
Okay, so Mark, Mark's just going to have to follow up with us on that one so we could find out what that's all about. So I'll be looking for more questions on the Europe, but honestly, with limited time, I think we want to dive right in. And we want to actually talk about this one, the War of the Pacific, 1941-45. So, but before I do that, I did forget one last step. I did miss a question I want to ask you, and that is, who have you been working with? So who did you have for support when you worked on the design for the War Europe, the expansion, and now the War of the Pacific? Tell us a little bit about who you've been working with, who's been helpful to you over the past 5-6 years.
Sure. Well, first, in no particular order, Mark Mahaffey has been outstanding in terms of his artwork. All you folks out there probably know his work. But I was very fortunate to be able to work with him on TW Europe and then on the expansion. And when he was able to step up and do the Pacific, I was really pleased. And I think the visuals on the TW Pacific game will be very pleasing to most players. Also a shout out to the developer, Joe Pilkus. Joe has been a real soldier all through this process. He's been with the process for years. I can't remember how many times he's been over the rules top to bottom, at least 4 that I know of. And we're talking line by line editing. Joe has spent a tremendous amount of time on the rules. So special thanks to Mark for the art and to Joe for a tremendous amount of input on the rule book.
And how is it for you, Ernie? Because I do appreciate you're one of several designers that always does a great job doing playtest sessions. You've done it at Console World Expo, other events, at Compass Expo as well. So can you share with us just some of your experiences from game conventions? Has that served a role for you, having your games played during the convention, especially, let's say they're playtest variety? I'm curious about your game convention experience with your designs.
It's been invaluable. I couldn't have done any of my designs without it. You get interacting face to face with people, getting comments right off the spot, and guys are honest when they say, "Hey, that rule is really stupid. I don't get it. I don't know why you have it that way." You get to talk to them and ask, well, why and what do you think and what do you think should be changed? I mean, you get an interaction with people that you don't get on a message board. So that's been invaluable. There's one difficulty with playtesting monster games, though, and that is that if it's a really big, you want to play the whole war start to finish, that's a big time commitment. And sometimes, even during a convention, you don't have time to do that.
Yeah, I saw some comments. People said that do the whole campaign. It's just not a play experience. It's not like you just pick up the game. You're going to learn it in a day or so and go through it. It's more like an immersion experience. Like you're really committing to a true, memorable gaming experience. You put in the time, and but you get to experience the whole campaign. Now we're talking about the Europe, of course, because we haven't got to Pacific yet. But I mean, Pacific's a pretty impressive looking package. I know the War Europe has 2 maps. But when I look here, it might be a little bit hard to see. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit larger for everybody. So this is actually all the components, sort of a preview graphic, everything that you're going to be seeing coming from the War of the Pacific. So we've got the box on the left, several rule booklets, pamphlets. We got a ton of counter sheets, which we can probably count from the product page. So lots of counter sheets and markers on the right. Got some nice displays. Looks like for the scenario displays, we've got all those. A lot of those actually got looks like we have a nice world operations map of the world. I see that blue geography.
Yeah.
Got some more displays and cards on the left quadrant there, and then the back of the box. So this is one heck of a impressive looking package. And now, did this come together? Were you thinking once the War Europe was done? Were you already thinking of going War Pacific, or was it because people started challenging you and saying, we really like the War Europe, I'd really like a combined experience or a standalone Pacific game? Was it your 100% you?
No, it was 100% players. I got, as soon as Europe came out, I thought, well, I'll take a breather here for a couple of years because I'm mentally exhausted from doing the war. But I got a lot of feedback from players saying, well, this would be really great if it had a combined Pacific, companion to it, so we could play the whole war, kind of like ETO, PTO, decision games, combo package. So I started working on the Pacific game pretty much right after we finished doing the war. So mostly customer feedback.
That's great. And then I want to show everybody the map. And these are the 2 maps. We have 2 maps for Europe, the War Europe. Now we have 2 maps for the Pacific. And to do this justice, I want to show you just as zoom down to 20% just to fit it on screen. But let's take this up a notch. So again, This is almost full width now. So I'm just going to scroll, slowly through this for Pacific, so everybody gets sort of a gander. We've got some hexes with colored outlines. We've obviously got some icons for what they represent, some special rules, etc. So objectives, etc. So as you can see, going through here, lots of really nice looking map, and I really like the fact that it's only 2 map sheets. I saw it set up at Expo, Compass Expo, and doesn't take up much table space, much like the War Europe. It's nice. It's a nice footprint, just being 2 map sheets. But yeah, it looks great. I have to say, the overall package looks great. It's consistent. It's also very important. It's consistent looking with the War Europe. Same style. Having Mark Mahaffey do it.
Yeah, that's why I needed to have Mark. I was very glad to have Mark do the Pacific game, so the feel, the style would be the same and consistent across both theaters.
Now, on this game, the War Pacific, I read right away in the product description, you say it right away, this is not just about converting the War Europe to the Pacific. It's not trying to find a way to it's not like taking a system that's already known and I'm going to retrograde it and I'm going to tinker with it and mold it into something that's going to cover the Pacific. You made a very bold, clear statement. This is not that approach. Yeah. So can you share with everybody, what's your design approach for the Pacific?
Well, the hardest thing to deal with, and I think 2 things. The 2 hardest things I think in a Pacific game, and Pacific veterans can correct me if they want, but first one is scale. You can't, because Pacific battles like Tarawa, for example, compare that to Stalingrad, and they're just totally different scales. So you can't take, an American 6-7 motorized infantry from Europe and say that this guy can land on a Pacific atoll. I mean, that's the equivalent of like half a dozen army divisions. So you just physically couldn't do that. So you have to change the scale. So in effect, you're talking regiments and brigades rather than divisions and corps, at least in the Pacific part of it. So that's a problem. The other one is figuring out how to make it interesting to be Japan, because historically it was really lopsided conflict. So how do you make it fun and interesting to be the Japanese?
How much focus was on carrier operations, or how would you say, what would you say was the focus of your design if you had to apportion certain areas of focus to it? Was carrier operations a focus, or were there other areas?
Carrier tops of the list. You've got to have a good carrier. You got to have fun, manageable, good carrier battles, so you don't have a Pacific game. That's critical. And people buy Pacific games because they're naval buffs. And so if it isn't possible to have a Coral Sea or a Midway or a Eastern Solomons, if it isn't possible to replicate that, not simulate, but to play it and have it make sense, then gamers aren't going to go for it. So yeah, carriers were number one. It took up a huge amount of time because it's not like Europe.
Was that the biggest challenge for you for this design up to date? Was it getting the carrier operations figured out, or was there another interesting challenge you felt you had to sort of, figure out?
Well, there are two of them. The carrier combat is the one. The second one that's really, really dicey is what to do with nationalist China, because fans of Pacific games know that in some cases, like Empire of the Rising Sun, or Empire of the Sun, I guess it is, GMT's card-driven game, China is just a box. It's totally abstracted, and that's one way to deal with it. Dealing with China is really, really tough because it's big scale, unlike the Pacific, but for most of the war, not much happened. So it's a really tricky thing to design. In my game, the politics and diplomacy and espionage is in China probably as important or more important than the military side.
Great. And then what I want to do is I want to show you, we've got some comments coming in since I showed that nice little portfolio of all the components. I just want to share a little bit about that. So from Mo's Gaming Table, Maurice Fitzgerald said, wow, it's a lot of stuff, right? So I noticed also, and maybe Mo saw this, I saw bottom left, there were some cards. What were those cards? What's the purpose of the game cards?
That's a direct clone from Europe, and I had to have equivalents in the Pacific. But what you really have to be aware of with a lot of smart, clever players out there is they'll break the system and find a way to make the same thing happen every game. And the cards are a way to beat that. The cards are for for submarine warfare. The cards are for strategic bombing. The cards are especially for diplomacy and espionage. Espionage and counter-espionage. The cards make sure that every game is going to be different. That's critical. Replayability.
Yeah. And then I think Darren makes a good comment here on Facebook. Thanks for joining, Darren. So yeah, this is the challenge, right? Many World War II Europe strategic games don't translate well when transferred to the Pacific. And I think that's exactly, what you were talking about, Ernie, is you really couldn't almost take that approach. You had to sort of, you weren't taking it and trying to make it fit the Pacific. So I think we talked about some of the challenges which you mentioned, which was scale. Also, you got China, how to treat China, the carrier operations, etc. So I think Darren's absolutely right. I think this is a big challenge, no question, that you've walked us through a little bit. Are there any other any final comments you want about? I think Darren's question is a great question about this whole. And I don't know too many people that have gone from the Pacific to Europe, by the way. I don't know if there's ever been games that have gone Pacific first, then Europe. Never.
I don't know why, but that seems to be the pattern. But back to Darren's point, one thing that was really different in order to deal with a major challenge was in the Pacific region or zone of the board. You can only have 1 and 2 factor breakdown units and 1 and 2 factor units carried across the Pacific to a Pacific island. You can carry full-size units to the continent like Australia or China, but essentially you have to break down units in order to carry them across the Pacific, so that you have a Guadalcanal scale battle or a Tarawa scale battle. If you don't do that, if you use whole core from Europe, like they do in Empire of the Rising Sun, which came out in the 90s, then you get some really absurd combat situations. So that was a huge challenge, but it works pretty neatly. I mean, it functions without a lot of administrative overhead.
I'm sorry, I was just wanting to show everybody something here quickly because there's some great questions coming in, and
Okay.
I want to share something on screen because I think it's important to do it. So here we go. So let me show this. I might have to, this will be good. So let me just show everybody this really quickly. So we're going to go here.
Yeah.
So this is on the Constant World forum. So just
Right.
FYI. So I don't know how many out there are familiar with Constant World forum. It's got that old Genie look because we just sort of copied Genie from 30th when I had hair that was no gray hair. Let's just put it that way. So yes, it's an older fireside chat interface, no threaded discussions. But under the World War II global multi-front folder, there's a lot of games that have been published. As you can see, lots and lots of games that have been published. So we're going to go to your topic, and this is what we mean by level of support. So what's unique about Ernie's folder here is you have an option that you can include one or more attachments, file attachments on the forum, right?
Yep.
You've got, I think, the record for number of file attachments that I've ever seen on Constant World forum. I think people would agree with me on that. It's a lot of, so basically, and that's going to feed to a question, a great question coming up that I'm going to use as my answer. But I just want to give kudos to you that it's amazing the support you give for the game everywhere. Of course, Board Game Geek everywhere. It's everywhere. You need to have a social footprint covering your game, but what you do on the forum is pretty darn amazing. So I just want to tip my hat to you. And I'm tipping my hat because I'm going to give you some really tough questions now.
Okay.
So that's the way I like doing this.
All right.
Everybody knows that. So here, let's start with, let me make sure I pick the right one. I don't want that one yet. I want to go, here's a good warm-up question for you from Eric on YouTube. Thanks for joining, Eric, on YouTube. So how does this game differ from World in Flames, which, by the way, I just got, I think, the big collector's edition. It's like a detergent-sized box. It's got like 5 things in it. But we've got World in Flames. Of course, I've never played it. But we've got World in Flames, and then we've got, of course, World at War, which is the GMTs. And what's the one before World at War? There's a game they did, the prelude to...
Advanced Third Reich.
Yeah, well, Advanced Third Reich, but also there's a game now they did at GMT. It's a separate title, so it's not through the lineage, but they did like a preamble to the World War II.
Gathering Storm.
Gathering Storm. So
that's the prequel.
So exactly. So we've got your game or your game. So let's combine them because this is a combination question, I think. So we've got the War, the Europe. We've got the War Pacific. You got your expansion for Europe. So how do you now compare that with World in Flames over here, World at War over there? Give us how you would compare and contrast. Great question from Eric.
Okay. Well, I've seen World in Flames played. I'm not a World in Flames player, but from what I've seen and in live and online, World in Flames has a game system where they keep adding modules, planes in flames, mech in flames. They have all these plugins, and from what I can see, they all look pretty interesting. But that's a game that's much older than mine, and it has evolved with. I think the collector's edition now has all kinds of exotic bells and whistles and plugins, all built into the same box. So I would say one huge difference is not so much the scale as the number of plugins that you get with Convoys in Flames and name it and add In Flames after it, and Australian Design Group has done it. World at War I know a lot better. World at War is, because I was on the playtest group as that evolved, the difficulty with with that one is not that it's a bad game. It's a really great game, actually. But at every point in the design process of World at War, the playtest group, if you could go the simpler way or the more complex but realistic way, at every fork in the road, players in the design group and Bruce decided to go the more realistic but more complicated way to deal with all kinds of things, whether it was oil or German raiders or whatever. So World at War is truly a tour de force. My game has sometimes been called World at War Light.
Yeah, which makes sense. I have to give kudos to, there was an author on Board Game Geek who I think people claim it's the best single post ever posted on Board Game Geek for a war game, which is pretty amazing to make a statement where actually people recognize it. And somebody wrote basically a mini novel of how he went about preparing to play A World at War. It went
on for like 35 pages.
35 pages. It went through all the pains and the emotions and real life happening. And literally, it's like you said, it's like it's an amazing post. So I would definitely recommend that people, if you do a search on A World at War, you'll find this probably the most popular by far post, because people say it's like the post of since BGG's ever existed. It's like it's an amazing piece of work. But
it's a lifestyle.
And it was from exactly. So here I'm going to answer this question first from Andy, because I sort of set it up. And again, I love Andy's question. So Andy's asking, and thanks for joining on Facebook, Andy. Why would I want this when and I'm thinking of Bulge and Stalingrad, East Front. I'm thinking Africa. Why would I want this when I have War in the Pacific, Eagle in the Sun, War in the Pacific 2, Empire of the Sun, Pacific War, so on and so on and so on. Sell me, it's not hard. So I think that's a great question, but I want to answer it first, and I'm just going to give an easy answer. Just again, look at the effort, just in the support, in the amount of support you're providing for the game here, and I mean the dedication you've put into it to bring enjoyment to others, plus the conventions, plus the way you've structured it, plus the fact you did an expansion that really helps with the War of Europe, that you've taken feedback from players to actually go through a few years to do the Pacific now, and not just do it as a retread of Europe, but treat it as a new design, and to get it to all work with Mark Mahaffey and the developer, etc. So I think just this page right here, just this one screenshot of all these file attachments, to me sort of earns you a chip at the table, that this is an amazing effort and achievement for one lifetime. But enough of me. His question is for you, not for me. So how do you want to address Andy's excellent question? Why would he want to bother with Pacific?
Excellent question. Let me, to prevent talking out of ignorance, why don't I talk about the ones I know something about? I didn't have the original War in the Pacific. I did have Decision Games War in the Pacific 2, the 2001 update, whatever it was. The difficulty with that one is that it's just so massive. I mean, it would take a whole garage to set it all up. I've seen it play at Consim World on multiple tables. It's just a stupendous investment of time. My game is a significant investment of time, but it pales compared to War in the Pacific. That's just huge. Empire of the Sun is apples and oranges in the sense that I played that, and it's a great game, and I think they have a second version of it, second edition of it. If you like card-driven games, then Empire of the Sun is a very interesting game. I'm a little squishy about the political will rules in Empire of the Sun. I know it's there for play balance, but it never struck me as being particularly plausible. The game's good. It's a lot of fun. Pacific War, I didn't play that when it came out, but GMT is coming out with Mark Herman is redoing it for GMT, I think. That looks interesting, but it looks much more, from what I've seen, it looks much more massive than my game. Although it's supposedly will have a whole lot of shorter scenarios, but it looks like a very challenging piece. I think there's a telescoping of time scales there to cover shorter battles. Interesting, but it sounds like a bigger, more complex product than mine would be. Can't tell you about Eagle and the Sun. Haven't played that. Can't tell you about that one.
I think for Eagle and the Sun, we can just call that SPI. I think it was sort of changed the numeric values, new colors on the map. I'm joking, but yeah, I don't. Yeah, that one's A good question. But Andy, you can answer your own question. Why would you want this game if you've got War in the Pacific, Eagle in the Sun, War in the Pacific 2, Empire of the Sun, Pacific War? Because you're a game collector. Obviously, you have all the Pacific games already, and there's Across the Pacific. Somebody mentioned from Pacific Rim. So there's all these Pacific games. Andy, I'm sure you have them all already. So do you really want to have a hole in your game collection for Pacific? Do you really want to have an empty space, seriously, of Pacific, and then no, the War of the Pacific? Seriously? I cannot fathom. I just can't imagine that happening. So no, great. Of course, I'm pulling Andy's leg. So great question there. So what I want to do though is I just want to close with you. I want to thank you. But before I let you go, I think people would like to know, do you have any plans to be working on anything else coming out in the future? Are you working on any other designs right now that you could share with us tonight?
Sure, two of them actually. One is, and I've just started a discussion board on Constant World to cover it. I have a little game called Sinister Empires that I'm working on. It should be, yeah, there's one of the map boards. It's based on the old Kriegspiel game from Avalon Hill, which wasn't much of a success, but it's a total redesign, 4 geomorphic boards, 200 counters, 20 pages of rules. It's meant to be one that you can play 2 or 3 games in an afternoon. It's an old-fashioned Avalon Hill type classic game redone in my own style. So I'm working on that. And I'm also working on a prequel game which will cover both TW Europe and TW the Pacific, tentatively called The Coming Darkness, which will cover the period 1935-1939 as a prequel that leads into both games.
Well, wonderful. I want to say, we had some great questions for you tonight. I want to appreciate everybody that's been online with you. We've had a lot of questions actually online in the last month or two about, will the War Europe be back in reprint? Can we pre-order it? So I'm happy to say yes, it's now back on pre-order. The Pacific, I think we're looking at later this year. We're looking for it to be released, if I'm not mistaken, later this year. So we're definitely excited about that as well. So good. I think with that, Ernie, I just want to, and I'll keep you on here. I think we'll do something a little different here. We'll actually say goodbye and end the session with you staying on here since I've pretty much covered everything else. So just a reminder for everybody that you can pre-order the reprint for the War Europe right now at Compass Games website. You can also order the expansion, which is available on shipping right now. And then definitely get your pre-order in for the War of the Pacific 41 through 45. I think we got some great information on the game. We're really looking forward to it. I know we'll see it being played at game conventions in the future. Just a reminder for everybody that we'll have our next town hall meeting on Thursday, July 23rd with Bill Thomas. So we'll do some updates again with Bill. I barely survived the last town hall, which was only number 3. So number 4, we'll see what happens. But hey, Ernie, it's been a great pleasure to have you on. I'll give you the last word before we call it a night. So I'll give you the floor.
To wrap up the night, well, I certainly have appreciated the opportunity to come on and talk about the games that I'm doing and that Compass is coming out with, and research and development on stuff in the pipeline. So I have played the War of the Pacific for years at game conventions and at home and so on. It's a lot of fun. I hope people enjoy it as much as I have done in designing it.
Well, thank you so much, Ernie. I'm going to let you go. It's been a real pleasure having you. We'll have you again after we, maybe when we have shipping, the Pacific shipping, we can do some more coverage about the game and all that. But I really appreciate everybody being online live with us today at different time zones. So thanks to everybody for being with us for episode 36. We'll be back in 2 weeks. But again, we'll be back next week with Bill Thomas for Town Hall number 4. So again, everybody, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you, Ernie. Good night, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.